Hello, my name is Jordan Proudfoot. I'm a personal trainer out of Seattle, Washington, and I wanted to talk to you today about breathing and some information about different ways to breathe, as well as going over a couple specific breathing protocols. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between what I call normal breathing, which is what most of us do through our nose and mouth, not really thinking about it, just breathing as we would, versus specific nasal breathing. Behind me here I have a couple things written on my board, and I'll zoom in on this so we can get a better look here in a little bit. So on the left hand side we have normal breathing. Again, this is nose, mouth, just not paying attention to it. So a couple things are problematic when we just default to this type of normal breathing. Some of those things are that we tend to overbreathe when we're just not paying attention to how we're breathing. And specifically what that is, what overbreathing is, we're taking in too much too much oxygen and releasing or expelling too much carbon dioxide. Now what that does is it changes the pH of our blood into be more of a alkaline pH, which has some downsides. Now specifically those downsides have to do with how oxygen is transported through our blood via hemoglobin, and there's ways that we can change that to our advantage. So when we're normally breathing, because we breathe in through our nose and mouth, and more probably through our mouth, and then we breathe out through our nose and mouth, and again more through our mouth because it's a wider opening, we end up dumping or getting rid of too much carbon dioxide. When we get rid of that carbon dioxide by exhaling through our mouth, that pH becomes more alkaline. That alkaline state actually increases the bond of hemoglobin with oxygen. So just a quick review, oxygen is transported in the blood via hemoglobin. The hemoglobin attaches to, the oxygen attaches to the hemoglobin, and then that brings it to our muscle tissue, our brain tissue, all the cells that need it in our body. When our blood is more alkaline, that bond is very, very strong. In fact, the hemoglobin does not want to release the oxygen that it has. So every molecule of hemoglobin has 4 spots for oxygen. Typically, we have 2 of those spots filled. And then when we do something like exercise, if we do that with normal breathing, we end up, that alkaline state signals our brain to increase its respiratory rate. So we breathe harder, breathe faster. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, just normal exercising. Once you start, your breathing rate increases, you're having to breathe even harder and faster, and eventually we get to a point where that's just not sustainable for the activity, and that's the end of our workout or our kind of threshold of what we can tolerate. Well, the bond of those 2 molecules of oxygen to the hemoglobin is very strong when it's more alkaline. And so instead of our body utilizing the oxygen that it already has, the signal to the brain is that we need actually more oxygen. So we need to breathe more, breathe deeper, breathe faster. And this almost becomes kind of like a state of anxiety where it's just really rapid breathing. Now, conversely, if we nasal breathe, what that allows us to do is we limit the amount of oxygen in, but more importantly, we limit the amount of carbon dioxide that comes out of our mouth. The nasal passageway is smaller, so we're not going to be able to get rid of as much, and we only have the 2 nasal canals instead of the 2 nasal and the mouth, right? So now we have reduced carbon dioxide output. What that's going to do is it's going to start to change the pH to be more acidic. That acidity allows that bond of the hemoglobin to the oxygen to release, and it allows our body to actually utilize the oxygen that we already have stored up. So what this means when we're exercising is we will not have to breathe as rapidly. We don't have to breathe quite as much quantity of oxygen either, because we're using it changes the chemistry, so we're more efficient with the oxygen that we have. So the other components that are at play here is that mechanically things shift when we nasal breathe only versus when we're breathing normally. Most often when we breathe normally, unless we're thinking about it again, we tend to breathe in our upper chest. There's a term called tidal breathing. This is using the top two lobes of your lungs. So the way that our lungs are oriented is you have two lobes on the left side, there's space for your heart there, and then three on the right side. And so when we just normal breathe, shallow breathe, we're really only pulling oxygen in these upper lobes, and we're not using our diaphragm, which is a horizontal muscle that sits at the top of our abdominal cavity. When we do more specifically nasal diaphragmatic breathing, which happens oftentimes when you just think about breathing through your nose, because there's smaller holes and you're going to be changing how you're breathing, your body shifts towards a more diaphragmatic style of breathing. Now, this definitely takes some attention, especially if you're unfamiliar with it, and can take a little bit of a training, but it's much, much easier to allow your body to diaphragmatic breathe when we're forced to do it just through the nose. So this changes, again, the mechanics of our breathing. Now with this comes some interesting components as well. Now if we find that we're trying to do nasal breathing only during exercising and we're unable to do that, a lot of times this can be a little bit of a sign or a red flag that there's maybe a compromise in our midline stabilization. Put another way, if I'm in a compromised position through my core, my diaphragm will not expand. The muscle isn't able to be utilized or contract in the same way. And so when I try to breathe, if I'm restricting myself to just breathe through my nose and I compromise this position, it's not going to work to use your diaphragm. So it can be a little bit of a red herring to know if we have a compromise in our positioning. And to that end, we also, as we improve focusing on the nasal diaphragmatic breathing, that forces us to be aware of the midline positioning and increases our midline stabilization. Other beneficial components of nasal breathing versus normal breathing or mouth breathing is that mouth breathing promotes a sympathetic nervous system response. Think fight or flight, think when you're anxious. This tends to shift towards a more mouth breathing, over breathing type versus being calm, rest and digest, relax, which is a parasympathetic nervous system state. This is promoted with the nasal diaphragmatic breathing. Another component that adds to that is when we're nasal diaphragmatic breathing, inhaling through our nose increases nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator, which also leads to the more sympathetic state that reduces the heart rate and allows the blood flow to flow more rapidly or less restrictively throughout the body. The nasal breathing also filters air with the nasal hair and mucus that gets produced. And all of these together allow for shorter recovery post-exercise. And again, a lot of that is because we are using less fuel. We're using less oxygen to produce the same output as we would otherwise.